3 days after Tommy vanished at the forest's edge, a German shepherd began to appear at their living room window, every morning, standing still as if keeping watch. Sarah would see the dog before her coffee cooled, a dark silhouette against the pines, ears alert, eyes steady. Michael counted days on a scrap of paper. The silence of the house had weight. It leaned on them. The dog's presence became a small, private ritual. It came at dawn. It came in the rain. It came the morning Sarah found the red knit cap folded on the back of a chair where Tommy used to toss it. The dog waited, then left when they stepped onto the porch, pausing at the yard's edge and looking back, as if saying, "Come." If this story touches you, tap like. It helps these stories reach others. They'd done everything the sheriff advised. Search parties combed the creek bed and called Tommy's name until throats burned. Volunteers scoured trails. Dogs from the county unit worked until the scent faded in the mud. The deputies were careful, professional, kind. Sheriff Patterson marked the timeline and the last known route. But maps and flashlights only reached so far. The shepherd's returns began to feel like the only answer that wouldn't fit into a logbook. It watched them with a patience that was almost human, then turned and stepped toward the Cascade Wilderness, pausing to look back, as if waiting for permission. They followed because what else do you do when hope has nowhere else to go? They followed aware it was risky, aware they were few against an old and complicated wood. Michael wrapped a length of rope around his palm and tucked a small flashlight into his jacket. Sarah left a note on their kitchen table for the deputies. "We're following the dog. If we don't return, call." Then she slipped her phone into her pocket and turned it off, because the glow felt like company, and she wanted only the quiet of the morning and the dog's path. The dog led with an ease that made every wrong turn feel like a choice it would correct. It moved along a creek that murmured under moss, waded through a shallow ford, and climbed where ferns smoothed the slope into a soft green staircase. Sarah breathed pine and cold water, and the faint smell of smoke in places where the wind carried an older scent. Michael marked trees with bright tape he'd carried from the car, a small trail in case they had to come back. The shepherd paused at each mark and looked at them, and each time Sarah felt a strange reassurance, as if the dog were measuring them for trust. They found the cabin before noon, unseen until the trees opened to a patch of broken roof and sagging beams. It sat in a small clearing like something that had been swallowed and then spat out by time. Dust settled in the slatted windows, ferns pushed through cracks in the floor. On a low table, half buried in leaves and the soft gray of neglect, Tommy's red knit cap lay folded, a bright, ridiculous thing against ruin.
Sarah's hands shook so badly she dropped to her knees and could not breathe for a full minute. Michael reached for the cap and brought it to her as if it were a lit candle. Tucked under the cap was a black and white photograph, edges frayed, the face of a man in a high-collared coat, looking stern and soft in the same breath. On the back, in shaky ink, a name, Theodore Harrison. The photo felt like a hinge, one simple image that opened a door none of them had known existed. They photographed it with a trembling hand and called the sheriff, who sent deputies to the site. The deputies found fresh footprints circling the clearing and the same deep paw prints that matched the shepherd's stride. Sheriff Patterson's voice over the radio was steady. He said they'd keep the area secure. At the town library, Agnes Hartley, the local historian, turned the photograph over with gloved fingers and told them a story that had lived in the town's margins for generations. The Harrisons had been in the woods for decades, she said, a family that preferred the trees to towns and kept to themselves. There were always rumors, tales of children who had strayed and been cared for, of dogs that paced the edge of the village like sentries. It was the kind of thing people half laughed at over coffee, the kind of thing that made mothers cross the street to avoid conversation. But the photograph matched the handwriting in old land deeds Agnes pulled from the archive, and the ruined cabin was on no current map. The name Theodore Harrison threaded the present to a far earlier time. Night fell hard and close the evening the shepherd returned with a different urgency. It paced the yard until Sarah opened the door. The dog did not sit at the edge this time. It began to run, not wildly, not panicked, but with a speed that said there was no time to waste. They followed at a distance, flashlights cutting ribbons through the dark, listening to the snap of twig and leaf. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The dog moved with purpose down a path that had been laid by many feet over many years, a narrow spoor that slipped between trunks and around fallen logs. Sarah's phone died somewhere between the creek and the hill. The battery had been fading all day. She didn't mind. There was an oldness to the route, a way the path bent like a remembered sentence. They emerged into a circular cedar clearing rimmed with trees whose trunks were black with age. In the center, a small camp flickered with firelight, smoke curling into a navy sky. Shadowed figures moved, not menacing but watchful. A woman, Rebecca, stepped forward with a child's hand tucked in hers, and a man with the same face as the photo, older but unmistakable, came from behind the trees. David Harrison's voice was low when he said, "We were waiting for them to come when the dog led them." He sounded both apologetic and relieved.
Tommy was there by a low bench, rubbing sleep from his eyes, cheeks flushed from too much warm stew and nights under a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. He looked smaller and braver than the memory Sarah had carried. He ran into her arms without the bit of hesitance that can make mothers hold their breath. The reunion was both wild and gentle. Sarah's sobs shook Tommy's shoulder. Michael stood with his hand pressed to his chest as if to slow a heart that wanted to run away. They learned in the hush that the boy had been found days earlier by Rebecca, while she and a couple of others were fetching water. He'd been hurt, yes, a banged head, a sprain, but not broken in the ways that haunt nightmares. He'd been fed, wrapped, and kept with a small cluster that moved with the seasons, people who lived in the forest and took in the ones who could not find their way. The Harrisons asked for a discretion with a softness that felt like an offering. "We don't come into town much," David said, "and we don't want the boys or the children exposed to—" His sentence trailed off into the wood smoke, and the meaning was clear. They had their own rules, their own ways of raising children under the cedars, away from town eyes. Agnes had called it a secretive clan. In the clearing it felt more like a hidden village stitched to the land. Michael understood, after a long silence, that sometimes kindness prefers its privacy. Before they left, David handed Sarah a small smooth stone, warm as if it had been cupped in a palm. It had a pale swirl across its face, like a faint river. "Leave this on the cabin when you go," he said. "It says you are here, and you keep the promise." Sarah asked what promise she was making, and David only smiled with a seriousness that made her chest ache. "To remember," he said. "To leave the place as you found it, to keep the children safe in the way you can." The shepherd walked them to the edge of the property the next morning and sat in the dappled light of the yard as if watching the house wake up. When they reached the road, the dog hesitated, then disappeared along a deer trail, melting into the cedar shadows as if it had never been there at all. The house felt different on the inside, stitched with a relief that could not be unraveled. Tommy slept through the first night back in his bed, the red cap folded on the pillow beside him like an exhale. Weeks later, when the news had settled into small-town conversation and the deputies closed the file with a respectful nod rather than fanfare, Sarah saw a young German shepherd sitting on the far side of the woods, head tilted, watching the children play in the yard. It was younger by the way it bounded, and curious by the way it sniffed the air, as if learning its own instructions. Sometimes it would lie down at the edge and watch the house until sunset, and then it would go. There was no grand explanation, only a feeling that circles had been closed and new ones had begun. They kept the stone on the mantle for a long time. Visitors who noticed it asked about it, and Sarah would say simply that it was a promise kept between people who understand the language of shelter. The black and white photo she left carefully wrapped in a drawer, where Agnes could study it further. The ruined cabin remained a place of quiet. They left the red cap in a small pile of leaves outside the door and placed the stone on its threshold, a small testament to the secrecy and mercy they'd been offered. In the months that followed, Sarah thought often about what it meant to be lost and to be found, not just in the physical sense, but the ways families are formed and reformed, how strangers can become a lifeline when the world narrows. The shepherd's daily returns had been the heartbeat of their sorrow and the compass of their hope. When people asked how they decided to follow a dog into the woods, Sarah would answer, "We didn't have much left to follow but each other and that animal's stare," and it sounded truer than any other explanation. There was, she believed, a kind of guardianship threaded through the place. Dogs that kept watch, people who chose to live on the margins and keep others safe, and a town that learned to hold both curiosity and respect. On an autumn afternoon, long after the leaves had turned and the creek ran lower, Tommy walked out to the yard with his red cap on, tied under his chin like a captain's. The young shepherd lay at the fence and wagged once, sure and steady. Tommy waved, and the dog responded with a tilt of its head, the small language they'd all come to understand. They were not the same family who had watched the windows for 3 endless days, but the love that had been tested and stretched in the forest felt deeper for it. If this moved you, share this story and subscribe for more true feeling tales.